Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Connection Valley Church on Zoom. If it is your first time, we want to let you know that it is our mission to influence people to life-giving connections with Jesus, their family, and the community. So connection is huge for us, and we hope that out of that connection with Jesus, our connections with our families and with the community around us are even better. And one of the things that we like to do is partner with organizations in our community that are already doing great work, that have missions of their own to make the world better. And we partner with an organization each month, and we give them a financial donation, and then we volunteer service hours. And so our community partner this month is Feeding Lisa's Kids, and it is a fantastic organization, and they are all about providing food to food insecure families in the High Point area. And Lisa Hawley, the director, is very passionate about making sure that kids do not go hungry. And we volunteer with them each month. This past Wednesday was our day that we were out helping with the food distribution. It was a great time, as always, getting to interact with the people that deliver the food to the families and the other volunteers that help with that distribution process. So it was a great morning. And we're giving them a financial gift this month as well. And each time someone shows up for the first time, we make an additional $10 donation in their honor, just kind of adding that to the financial gifts that we give them this month. So when you invite your friends and they show up, it just helps these organizations in our community that are doing great work. So thank you for inviting people. Thank you for giving generously so that we are able to make those kinds of connections in our community. I think that's really the only announcement-y type thing for this morning, but I do want to mention, some of you may have noticed on the calendar that today is September 11th, and 21 years ago, we all experienced the devastating events that happened in our country. And there are people who lost loved ones. There are so many heroes that stepped in to search for missing people, and many people lost their lives as a result of the events of that day. And so it would be bad of us to neglect remembering, taking a moment to reflect, to be thankful for those who were heroic in their efforts, and also remembering those whose lives were lost. And so today we start a series on grief called Good Grief. So kind of interesting that the series on grief starts on a Sunday like today. And so I'm going to hand it over to Brian and let him kind of get us kicked off into the series. And we're just thankful that you guys are here to be with us today.
Thanks, Brooke. Just to let you guys know, Jim wasn't able to sign in. So for whatever reason on his end, he had some technical issues. So we won't be having music this morning, but we'll dive right in after I pray. God, we thank you that you're here with us today, and that you can do a lot when we approach you in our grief from our loss that all of us have experienced. And we thank you just for the people that are here today and that will watch later. And I just pray you'd give them just a greater glimpse of who you are and your love, even when they don't understand. So we thank you for this time, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So my first memory of loss was when I was 5 years old. My parents came to my room, and they were talking to me about my cat. And my cat they said, been put to sleep, which I didn't know exactly what that meant. But my cat had been put to sleep because of having something called feline leukemia. And all I knew is that it was bad, and that my cat Sylvester would no longer be here. And while I don't remember being devastated by that, it's one of the first times I remember losing something that was important, or someone who was important to me. Fast forward a few years later, when I was in the third grade, and but for me was my first substantial loss. And this was when I came home from school in third grade, my mom brought me home, and I got out of my car and I look over in my front yard and I see my dog. His name was Maxie. Dog was laying in the front yard. And that was odd because, well, the dog shouldn't have just been laying in the front yard, but that was kind of a different era where dogs would run loose sometimes. And he was laying in the front yard and he was motionless, like he wasn't moving. And typically Maxie was a whirling dervish of action. Like his rear end is always shaking. He was happy. He was one of those dogs that you really like being around because he can make you feel great when you feel bad. But I saw him laying motionless. And so I called him and he didn't move. And I remember right now, like it was yesterday, walking over and looking down at him and seeing his motionless body, eyes closed. And I remember the ants crawling on him because he had died. And I was devastated. I just remember that was devastating to me. And I wanted to fix it. I couldn't fix it. Found out later he was hit by a truck while he was chasing a garbage truck, which I just hate it that it happened that way. But I remember feeling really sad. And that was the first time I remember ever experiencing what seemed like substantial loss to me. And then I was thinking back this week as I was entering into the times I felt grief and loss and the pain that goes with that. And I started thinking back to when I played youth sports as a kid and being on teams where we would lose and it would just feel like the worst to lose a game. And that's the era of life. I'm a little bit older than obviously the kids who are playing youth sports now, where we had a winner, we had a clear winner and a clear loser. And I don't really have a problem with that because you don't win all the time in life and you have to learn how to lose in a way that's graceful. I can't say that I'm there yet, but I'm still working on it. But I remember feeling really bad about some of the times my teams would lose, and I didn't like losing then, and I don't like losing now. Then I started thinking about friendships where I was close with somebody and then something happened and then I wasn't close with them anymore. I thought about romantic relationships and stuff that happened in middle school and high school and in college that I thought, man, this relationship was going somewhere and then it didn't. And I remember some of the pain that I felt from the loss of those relationships. And then I thought about the people in my life who I've loved, like my grandparents and my dad who have passed away and friends who have passed away. And as I was entering into all this, then I also thought about what happened 21 years ago. And I think all of you who are with us right now, watching right now, you know what happened 21 years ago. You remember very vividly where you were 21 years ago because of what happened on September 11th, 2001. And you probably remember where you were when you became aware of the attacks from the terrorists when they flew their planes into the Twin Towers in New York, and then later into the Pentagon, and then later another plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. And you probably remember where you were. You probably remember contacting the people you loved the most because you wanted to make sure they were okay. And I just remember that day being extremely unsettling. Brooke and I were in a public high school. We were there to teach character education in this program they did once a month. And I remember being in this classroom with kids watching on the TV they had in the classroom an airplane fly into the South Tower in New York. And I just remember going, what is going on? Like it didn't even seem real. And that day, I just remember watching reports throughout the entire day and checking on loved ones and making sure that everyone was okay. And what happened as a result of that trauma was there was a loss of really freedom. Right? I mean, like going to an airport, even now, 21 years later, that's no bowl of cherries. I mean, going to an airport, they basically have to strip, take off your clothes. I mean, if you have a belt, you have to take that off. You have shoes, you have to take that off. That's gross, especially if someone's wearing flip-flops. But going into an airport is just not what it used to be. And it's because of what happened in 9/11. And we lost freedom because of the terrorist attacks that day. We also, some of us lost financially. I mean, it was a crazy time, and the financial markets were impacted, at least initially, and in a very negative way. And so some of you were hurt financially, and some of you were hurt in your faith. You lost faith. You're like, how could God allow this to happen? Why would God permit this to happen? If he's all loving and he's sovereign, why would this even be something he would permit? I think that's understandable to feel and to think those things. Which then, as I was reflecting on the losses that we've experienced together in our lives, I thought about March of 2020, 2.5 years ago. I remember when I first found out about this COVID-19, which we were calling a coronavirus a lot at that point in time. I remember we were finding out about it, thinking that, oh, in a couple of weeks, everything will be back to normal. Some of you may have remembered feeling that way or thinking that way. And for the first time in my life, I heard the term social distancing, which I'd never heard that term before, or that phrase before, but I heard that spoken a lot in the beginning. And people were saying we needed to stay 6 feet away and needed to wear a mask. And it wasn't too long where I started feeling the loss of connection with other people, being in proximity, being able to give someone a hug. I like to hug people, giving someone a handshake. So some people, I remember through the course of the last 2.5 years, they wouldn't even fist bump me. Like I had someone one time, like I went in for a fist bump and they gave me their elbow, and it created some weird interaction. And I remember feeling a loss of connection, which a lot of you have felt as well. We couldn't meet and gather in a building to worship God. And so it was part of what, in a good way, it's part of where Connection Valley was born, here on Zoom. But I just remember feeling that loss of connection. And a lot of you did too, with it, whether it was church or school or work. My son, Matt, can no longer walk in a official graduation ceremony because of what happened with COVID-19. And he felt the loss. We felt the loss of that. He was not able to compete in his spring season of track, which he had been training so hard for. And it was just like, it was done. And it was like, he was done with pretty much high school and being able to compete. And it was like, that was it. And I just remember him processing those thoughts and feelings around that. And my daughter, Mia, and again, a lot of you, there were funerals that you weren't able to attend. I was thankful that my grandmother died in February of 2020 because I was still able to go to her funeral and speak at her funeral and remember her life. And if it had happened like a month or so later, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And that would have been something that I would have felt on a deep level, because my grandmother was very instrumental in our family's faith journey. And some of you had funerals that you couldn't go to because of what happened with COVID-19. And then beyond that, there was graduations that I mentioned. There were weddings that you weren't able to go to. And it just felt like this really overwhelming bad loss. And there are probably more events and things like that you missed. But going even beyond that, there are people that are part of our church, and maybe this includes you, that lost family members because, like, to death because of COVID and because of what happened 2.5 years ago. And we're still dealing with the effects of it. It just, for me, and I think for a lot of you that you felt the loss in a more pronounced way, we're learning how to navigate that and to manage it at this point in time, but it's not something that we've got all figured out. And I bring all this up because loss is part of the human experience. Loss is something that we experience as we get older and we go into life, and it just actually escalates. I mean, the magnitude of the losses oftentimes escalate as we get older. But the one thing that's true is it's part of the human experience, and loss is inevitable for you and me. And I imagine that as I've talked at the beginning of this time, that you've thought back on losses you've had. And some of them have been really big and some of them have been smaller. Maybe they seemed really big in the moment and you realize, well, maybe they weren't as big as they really seemed to be. But regardless, the pain was still there. Some of the losses maybe you've experienced have been temporary. Maybe you've broken a leg before or an arm before. And it's much like that it's painful to not be able to use your arm or your leg, but it was a temporary experience that eventually you had relief from. Or maybe your loss has been more like an amputation, permanent. Life is never the same as it was before. And the reality is we're going to experience both gradual and immediate pain over the course of our lives. Like when my father passed away from cancer, that was a slow process and it was a very painful process. But then at the same time, some people lose a loved one in a traumatic event and it happens all at once. And they're having to process that. And through the course of this series, I'm going to be talking more about the catastrophic amputation type losses like death of a loved one or a divorce and the impact that has on the couple getting divorced and their family, or debilitating health issues. Because the reality is we or someone we love, we're going to face all those things. And knowing how to do that well, I think is extremely important. Knowing how to grieve in a way that's helpful and healthy, it's extremely important because as someone mentioned in the conversation with me today, we can grieve in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. And so this series of Good Grief is really all about helping you grieve in a healthy way. Some of you remember some of the catastrophic losses or that you're currently experiencing or that you have experienced. You're thinking about those right now. And you really can think about the loss of control that you felt or the darkness that you felt, the dark pain that you felt, even wondering why God allowed it to happen. And that can feel so perplexing, confusing, hurtful. And one of the things we're going to do in this series and today is we're going to talk about a guy that he probably experienced loss on a level that's beyond my comprehension and maybe yours, but the principles that we're going to learn from him about loss and about God, I think are going to be extremely helpful. And he's a guy who lived a long time ago, and his story is contained in the Bible, and his name is Job, spelled J-O-B. When I was a kid, I used to think his name was Job, but that's not accurate. So if you see the letters J-O-B in the Bible, it's probably referring to the person known as Job. And Job has a story of loss and suffering and grief that I think is to some degree confusing at times, but also liberating because you understand more about what you experience, what we experience when we lose something or someone special to us, but you also get a greater understanding of who God is. And so we're going to pick up the story at the very beginning where we find out about Job, who was an incredible guy. In Job chapter 1, verse 1, the writer of Job, which it's said to be Moses, writes this: "In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. The man was blameless and upright." That means he was a good dude. You know, he did the right things. He was wise and he feared God and he shunned evil. He stuck up the hand to evil. He wasn't a guy that was given to make unwise choices or wrong choices or choices that would hurt him or the people he loved. And in verse 2, the writer says he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. So he had a big family. And in that culture, having a big family would be seen as a blessing from God. Furthermore, he had a lot of means. Now, when I tell you about what he had, it may not sound that great, but in that culture, it would have been the equivalent of a lot of wealth. And so in verse 3, we see that he owned 7,000 sheep. Can you imagine just 7,000 sheep? That's a lot of sheep. And in a very agricultural, rural society, 7,000 sheep would have been like gold. He also had 3,000 camels, which I've ridden a camel before. I took a trip to Egypt a long time ago. And if you ever ride a camel, ask me, like how to get off the camel, how to dismount the camel, because how you do that is very important. It can be a very painful experience. But Job, he had a lot of camels, 3,000, as a matter of fact, and then 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys and a large number of servants. So he had a big team of people working for him. He had all these animals, which would have been the equivalent of a lot of wealth. And he was known as the greatest man of all the people of the East. Those are a lot of great things to have. And his kids are a little bit wild, but he still tried to make atonement for them. And then if you keep reading in chapter 1 of Job, an interaction happens that's a little bit unsettling. Well, maybe a lot unsettling. There are a group of angels that come to God, and Satan is included in that. And Satan makes an appeal to God saying that if he were to take away, if God were to take away or permit his stuff and his family to be taken away from him, that Job would deny God, that Job would curse God, that Job would no longer be blameless or upright. And God pretty much said, okay, I'm going to permit you to take away what he has, which for me is extremely unsettling. I don't like that. I don't like that conversation. Like I would not agree to that, but I'm not God. So in this moment of time, Satan basically comes in and he takes away Job's possessions and his kids. And this is how he responds, which I think his response is remarkable. In verse 20 of chapter 1, Job gets up, he tears his robe and shaves his head, which are expressions in that culture of mourning, grieving. And he falls to the ground, and get this, he worships God. He's lost all of his possessions, he's lost his kids, yet his first reaction is worship. And I'm going, man, you don't even seem real. You don't even seem human. Like I can't imagine doing that, but Job did that. And he said this, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And then in verse 22, and all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And to me, this is remarkable because Job didn't have a mindset that he deserved or was entitled to what he had. And that's a remarkable response. Satan didn't like that so much. A lot of times when we're doing the right thing, Satan sees that as a threat. And so he doesn't want us to be successful. And so he comes at us again, but he's still subordinate to God the Father. And so he approaches God again and he says, okay, look, maybe I was wrong the first time, but if you take away Job's health, well, he will surely curse you. And so God said, well, I'll permit you to inflict him and basically hurt his health, but you can't kill him. And I will tell you this, I believe Job will still serve me. So Satan in verse 7 of chapter 2, we see that Satan goes out from the presence of the Lord and he afflicts Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet all the way up to the crown of his head. And as a response, Job takes some broken pottery and he scrapes himself because he's in so much pain. Everything is so itchy. And he scrapes himself with it, and he's sitting in ashes, which again would be a sign of mourning. Have you ever just felt so just horrible that all you can do is just scratch yourself because maybe when you're a kid you had chicken pox or you've had something like that before, like maybe a really bad poison ivy outbreak? But I can't imagine having that all over my body, and they're sores and they're painful and they're itchy. And this is now his state after losing everything that he had. And so in verse 9, his wife says to him, Job, are you still maintaining your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die? So his wife did what I think a lot of people would do and have done, like curse him. He's not for you. Just get it over with. Just die. And Job responds like this: you are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Now, again, that doesn't feel human to me. I don't know many people who would have that mentality. I think I know some, but it's not a large group of people. So at this point, there's still probably a degree of disconnect with Job and his response to his suffering and how he's grieving his losses. But I'll just say this, we're not done yet. A week passes. Job sits in silence for 1 week. I can't imagine sitting in silence for 1 week. And he's sitting in silence with 3 friends who came to visit him and to check on him. And his friends don't say anything. Like they're sitting together. I don't know if they were staring at him, but for 1 week, silence. Can you imagine how slow the time would pass? And with the pain that he felt emotionally and physically, I bet that it was overwhelming. And finally, we see in chapter 3, verse 1 of Job, that he speaks up and he says this. Job opens his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. Have you ever felt like your life is so bad that it would have been better off if you had never existed? I think, unfortunately, this is the thought that a lot of people have that commit suicide. It would just be better if I wasn't here. If you tell yourself that time and time again, I think you can begin to believe that. And based on this interaction with Job, Satan, the Lord, Satan is conspiring against you, and he wants to plant thoughts in your head, lies in your head about who you are and who other people are. And if he can get you to agree with those lies and thoughts, then he's got you captive. And so Job is cursing the day of his birth. Now he's starting to seem a little more human. He's starting to open up. And as a matter of fact, when we keep reading through the subsequent chapters, there's an interaction between Job and his friends. And we're going to talk more about his friends next week. We're not going to talk about his friends today as much, but we're going to talk about them next week and how your friends can either help or hurt, and even how to be a good friend to someone who is hurting. But we're not going to do that today. That's going to be next week. So you want to make sure you tune in next week, because this series is going to build. But for our purposes today, I want to share with you some of the thoughts that Job had and he shared that's contained in the book of Job. In chapter 3, verse 24, Job says this: "For sighing has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water." Have you ever been in a state where you are sighing over and over again, as much as you probably would be hungry during the day? Like that's become just what is coming out of you, because you're in so much trauma, you're in so much pain, you feel so much distress and so much despair that just, it's just constant. And then groaning. Just, have you ever been to the point where words aren't adequate and you just groan because of the pain you feel emotionally and maybe even physically? If you've been there, you're not alone, because that's where Job was. As a matter of fact, in the conversations I've had with people, a lot of you have been there, and I have been there at points in time in my life. He continues in verse 25 of chapter 3. He says, "What I feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me." And he says, "I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil." And the visual I have of what's happening internally inside of Job, because of what he's expressing, as he's got like this hamster wheel of activity as he replays the painful memories that he's experienced in losing his possessions and his family and his health. And he can't get any peace from it because it's all he can think about. And if you've ever been consumed by your pain, well, you're not alone. And then skipping ahead, there's interaction with Job and his friends. In chapter 7, verse 4, he says, "When I lie down, I think, how long before I get up?" If you struggled with insomnia before, this was going to hit home. He writes, "The night drags on and I toss and I turn until dawn." And I understand this dynamic because I've been there before. Can't sleep, have insomnia, replaying what you've lost. And then skipping down to verse 6 in chapter 7, he says this to God: "Remember, O God, that my life is but a breath." My life is basically saying my life is temporary. It's my eyes, and he goes on to say, "My eyes will never see happiness again." Did you hear what he said? never. This is the state he's in. You may have been there before where things are so bad that it feels like you could never be happy again. And that's exactly where Job is. And skipping down to verse 20 in chapter 7, he writes and says this to God, if I've sinned, what have I done to you? So now Job is wondering, hey, did I do something wrong to get this kind of treatment? Is there something I'm not aware of? Like, God, if I've sinned, what did I do? Like, what have I done to you? You see everything we do. And then he asked this question. I think this question is something that's so pointed. It really jumped out to me. He said, why have you made me your target? He feels targeted by God. He feels like God has personally come against him. He doesn't know why. And if you ever ask the question, why God? Why God? Well, you're not alone. And he says, have I become a burden to you? And then skipping to chapter 9, verses 25 through 31. Chapter 9, verses 25 through 31. He uses some very descriptive language. He says, my days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy. He's used the statement, I'll never see happiness again. And my days go by without a glimpse of joy. He's using extreme statements, which we often use when we feel distress, always and never. Maybe in some of your relationships before, you've used the terms always and never when you're experiencing distress in that relationship. And this is what Job is feeling in his relationship with God. And he goes on to say, my days skim past like boats of papyrus. Boats of papyrus would go very fast. He said, my days are like that. Like eagles swooping down their prey. When an eagle swoops in for its prey, it's a very quick kill. It's a very quick capture. And Job then continues, if I say I will forget my complaint, I will change my expression and smile. Like I'll just try to fake it till I make it. I'll change my expression and I'll smile. Maybe you've done that before. You put on like that fake smile that looks like a creepy clown, like, and it's like, it doesn't work. We can try to do that on outside and change the outside, but it doesn't work if your inside is in turmoil. Eventually that stuff just blows up. And then he continues, I still dread all my sufferings, for I know you will not hold me innocent. And so again, he feels like God is coming against him. Since I'm already found guilty, why should I struggle in vain? Like, why should I even try? I'm already guilty. Why should I struggle in vain? Why try? If you've ever been there before with the why try, you're not alone. And even if I wash myself with soap and my hands with cleansing powder, you would plunge me into a slime pit so that even my clothes would detest me. Job is in a dark place. In verses 9 through 14 in chapter 16. So we're skipping down to 16. He's had some more interaction with his friends. And so in chapter 16, verse 9, he continues, and it's like this crescendo, like it's a build here of his pain that he's expressing. He said, God assails me and tears me in his anger and gnashes his teeth at me. My opponent fastens on me his piercing eyes, and people open their mouths to jeer at me. They strike my cheek in scorn and unite together against me. God has turned me over to the ungodly and thrown me into the clutches of the wicked. All was well with me, but he shattered me. He seized me by the neck and he crushed me, and he has made me his target, and his archers surround me without pity. He pierces my kidneys and spills my gall on the ground. He says, he has made me his target. Again, he feels targeted by God. If you've ever felt targeted by God based on what's happening in your life, well, you're not alone. And in verse 14, he says, again and again, he burst upon me. He rushes at me like a warrior. And as I reflected on all that Job expressed just on the portions I shared, because there is a lot more if you go back and read the book of Job. These are some of the thoughts that Job was having in his grief and in his loss and in his suffering and in his pain and in his trauma and in his brokenness. The thoughts like this: first, God gives and takes away, and I will praise him regardless. God gives and takes away, and I will praise him regardless. That's where he started, right? He worshiped God. Then he said, we should accept both good and bad from God. He said that to his wife. We should accept both good and bad from God. But then after that week of silence, this is some of the thoughts he had, kind of recapping what we talked about here. I wish I'd never been born. I feel fear, dread, have no peace, no quietness, and no rest. I can't sleep. I will never see happiness again. Why are you targeting me, God? My days are joyless. Why even try? And if you've ever been in any of these places where you've had those thoughts, I hope you take comfort in today that you're not alone. As a matter of fact, Job is not the only one that's ever felt this. Probably every person that is listening right now has felt or thought these things. That's what happens when you suffer catastrophic loss, like an amputation. You have thoughts and feelings that are much like he's expressed. The good thing about grieving and mourning, even if it's not pretty or sanitized, is what Jesus said about mourning and grieving. In Matthew 5:4, Jesus's disciple Matthew wrote this, what Jesus said in terms of why we should grieve and mourn. He said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Some of you know that. It's one of the Beatitudes, but blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What he doesn't say is exactly when they will be comforted, but comfort is going to be something you experience when you mourn eventually. Maybe it's you experience comfort some days and distress others. But it's one of the reasons why Jesus even came to die for us, to give us life beyond this life and to have the comfort that this isn't all there is. Because if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, that means that what you're experiencing now is all there is. And when you're in the trauma, when you're in the catastrophic loss that we all will experience, well, it's real easy to become jaded and to give up. You know, I don't know what your catastrophic losses have been, but I'm going to share some possibilities with you. And some of these are things I've already shared, but I want to bring them back up. It could be death of a pet. It could be a divorce. It could be an estranged relationship. It could be a permanent injury. It could be a loss of parental custody, a loss of a job, a loss of a significant other, a child, or someone else. But it's important to know that it's okay to struggle and it's important to grieve. These are some of the feelings you may have felt. I have my feelings wheel right here. Some of you have one of these on your refrigerator, and if you need one or want one, we'll make sure you get one. But sometimes it's good to identify what we're feeling. And maybe in your catastrophic losses, you have felt sorrow and shock and anger and confusion and numbness and regret and emptiness, loneliness, fear, guilt, hopelessness, shame, denial, and vindictiveness, gratitude, relief, and bittersweet happy memories. Those are all possibilities that you've felt when you are having thoughts that are grieving the loss that you've experienced. And one of the things I want to share with you as like a big takeaway for today is, like Job, it's important to get out what is in, or in other words, get what is inside to the outside. I'm going to say that again because this is so important. To get what is inside to the outside, that may be expressed through the means of journaling. Journaling can be a powerful experience. It could be through the means of your expression to God, much like Job was expressing to God, or to friends. Hopefully they're friends that are helpful, not hurtful, but even expressing how you're feeling, what you're thinking to your friends. That can be extremely important in the grieving process, because if you keep it internal, it blows up like a bomb. I was reading a book a few years ago after my father passed away called A Disguised Grace by a guy named Jerry Sittser. Say Sittser 5 times. No, don't do that. That's kind of a dangerous game. But Jerry Sittser wrote a book called A Disguised Grace, and he wrote it out of his own trauma and pain. And I'll just give you a brief synopsis on what happened with Jerry. He was driving home one night after doing ministry to a group of Native Americans at a Native American reservation. I think it was in Idaho. And he was driving home with his entire family, his mom, his wife, and his 4 children. And on his way home, he saw a car that was in his lane heading in his direction. He's like, that doesn't seem like they're paying attention. And the car ended up striking his vehicle. And as a result, he lost his mom, he lost his wife, and he lost his daughter. 3 generations in one accident. I cannot imagine the trauma and pain that Jerry was experiencing. And so in his book, A Disguised Grace, he writes about what he experienced on the other side of it. And it ended up becoming a book because so many people said, you need to share this with other people and your pain doesn't need to be wasted. And so eventually he made it into a book. And he shared in this book about a dream he would have about so desperately wanting to be back in the light and feel light again. And in this dream, he would see the sun in the west, and he would be chasing toward the sun in the west as the sun was setting. And he would look over his shoulder and he would see the darkness encroaching on him. And as he ran harder and harder, it seemed like the sun was descending faster and faster to the point that he was experiencing twilight, realizing that he was never going to make it to the light and the comfort and the warmth of the sun. And then he was completely shrouded in darkness and he just fell into a heap. And that was the dream. He shared this with his sister, and his sister said, Jerry, you know, one of the things about grief that might be helpful, and when you're talking about this dream, is to think about turning around, and instead of heading west, head east, because you will get to the sunlight faster heading east, knowing that there is a sunrise that will be coming. And Jerry used this to illustrate the importance of walking into the darkness, of plunging into the darkness to get to the light. And for some of us, that's where you are right now, that you need to turn around and stop chasing the sun that's setting in the west and turn around and walk into the darkness to get to the sunrise or the sunrise. I don't know where you are, but that may be where you need to be. And Jerry goes on to express this, and I'm going to read this to you because I thought it was so good. He talked about the experience of the loss doesn't have to be the defining moment of your lives. It is our response to the loss that can become the defining moment of our lives and loss. It is not what happens to us that matters as much as what happens in us. And when I read that in his book, A Disguised Grace, I thought about how God doesn't ever want to waste our hurt. That when we allow light to come into the pain, we're inviting his healing. Even if it's gnarly, we're inviting his healing, but we're also potentially being a light to other people who have suffered in a similar fashion. Some of you know what this is like because you've, instead of chasing the sunset, you've walked into the darkness and you've seen the light of the sunrise, and you've experienced that by helping other people. But here are a few conclusions I have from my own loss and being around people who have suffered catastrophic loss. And maybe these observations will be helpful for you as you process. Number one, grief is needed, normal, and natural. One of the worst things we can do is try to bury it. Maybe if it's a loss of a person, to pretend like they never existed. That's what a lot of people do. But grief is needed, normal, and natural, and it doesn't have a time limit. Also, God can handle hearing your painful thoughts and feelings. God can handle hearing your painful thoughts and feelings. As a matter of fact, they need to come out, because if they don't, they will blow up inside of you. Another one, entering your pain is needed to experience healing, which we've talked about. Entering into the pain, the darkness gets you to the light. Here's another thought. Grief is not a series of sequential steps. Grief is not a series of sequential steps. We don't grieve and like we're done with a particular stage of grief. You know, some people have misapplied Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief from her book of Death and Dying that was written in the 1970s, where she said the first stage was denial, and then anger, and then bargaining, and then depression, and then acceptance. Like those are definitely stages of grief, but we don't go through them in a very straight line. As a matter of fact, we tend to pop all around these 5 stages of grief as we're grieving a catastrophic loss. So know that it's not meant to be a series of sequential steps. As a matter of fact, when anniversaries come up of a loss, whether it's a person or a divorce or something else, a memory of some sort, you may go right back into sadness or despair or distress. But you know that on the other side of that, there is light and there is healing. And then last, but certainly not least, grief is a process. It's a process. And to some degree, when we suffer a catastrophic loss, we deal with it for life, but it doesn't have to be bad and dark the entire time. Brooke was sharing with me last night a quote that I really thought was awesome in light of what we're talking about. A lot of you know that Queen Elizabeth passed away this past week, and her son, now King Charles, said that grief is the price we pay for love. He's quoting his mom, which is, I think, pretty touching, but grief is the price we pay for love. And when we love big, I think we grieve big because we feel big. So with all that shared today, this is kind of the foundation for this Good Grief series. I want to challenge you to get what is inside to the outside and to walk into the darkness to get to the sunrise and watch what God does in your life. In just a moment, I've noticed that my friend Jim was able to make it into the room. He's going to lead us in a song, Death Was Arrested, which is one of my favorites. And I think it captures what Jesus offers us even in the middle of our pain. See, he came and he lived a life that was perfect. He was truly blameless and yet suffered a horrible criminal's death on a cross so that we could be forgiven and have life beyond this life, so that we could live for something beyond what we experience now. And so we have that hope when we believe in Jesus and put our faith in him. So we'll be singing that song to finish today. And so I'm going to pray for us, and I'm going to hand it over to my friend. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are working in our lives, even when we don't see it or feel it. And I pray you'd help us to take whatever next step we need to take to get out what's on the inside to the outside, whether it's journaling, talking to you, or even some trusted friends, knowing that you can take us into the light and use our pain for a purpose. So we thank you for Jesus, and we thank you for the promise of eternity for those of us who believe in him. And we look forward just to seeing what you're going to do in and through us as a result of what we talk about in this series. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.